In the early 18th century, the religious landscape of the British North American colonies was defined by a tightly controlled hierarchical system that functioned as both a spiritual authority and a mechanism of social order. Established churches, often supported directly or indirectly by colonial governments, held a near monopoly over religious life. Authority was concentrated in ordained clergy, whose legitimacy derived not only from theological training but also from institutional recognition, and in colonial officials who reinforced ecclesiastical structures as part of broader governance. Within this framework, faith was frequently expressed through formal adherence to doctrine, intellectual assent to theological propositions, and participation in prescribed rituals. Religion, in this sense, operated less as a lived, immediate experience and more as a mediated system in which access to the divine was filtered through authorized interpreters. Ordinary individuals were positioned as recipients rather than agents of spiritual meaning, dependent on sermons, sacraments, and institutional approval to validate their standing before God. This arrangement created a stable but rigid religious order, one that mirrored and reinforced existing social hierarchies. Spiritual legitimacy and social respectability were often intertwined, such that those with education, status, or proximity to institutional power enjoyed a kind of presumed moral authority. At the same time, this system carried inherent limitations. Its emphasis on intellectualized belief and outward conformity risked detaching religion from the immediacy of personal experience. Faith could become performative, a matter of correct expression rather than inward transformation. It is precisely within this context that the revival in Northampton emerged as a disruptive force, challenging not only theological assumptions but also the distribution of power embedded within the religious system. The awakening associated with Jonathan Edwards did not originate as a top-down reform imposed by institutional leaders. Instead, it unfolded as a bottom-up movement driven by the emotional and spiritual responses of ordinary people. This grassroots character was crucial. It meant that the revival did not simply adjust existing structures or tasks. It called them into question. The authority of clergy and the legitimacy of elite interpretations of faith were no longer taken for granted. If individuals could encounter the divine directly, if they could experience conviction, repentance, and transformation without mediation, then the entire logic of a controlled, hierarchical religious order was destabilized. The awakening thus represented not merely a renewal of piety, but a reconfiguration of where religious authorities resided. To understand the depth of this shift, it is useful to compare the dominant religious model of the early 1700s with what unfolded in Northampton. The established system relied on standardized doctrine and institutional continuity. Its strength lay in its ability to maintain order, to ensure that belief remained consistent and aligned with accepted norms. Yet this very strength was also a weakness. By prioritizing uniformity and control, it often left little room for the unpredictable, affective dimensions of faith, the moments of crisis, doubt, and revelation that resist neat categorization. In contrast, the Northampton revival was marked by spontaneity and intensity. It emerged from the collective experiences of the community rather than from official directives. Participants reported a profound sense of direct engagement with the divine, an encounter that bypassed traditional channels of authority. This shift can be described as a movement from received belief to experienced belief. In the earlier model, faith was something one inherited, learned, and demonstrated through conformity. In the revival context, faith became something one underwent, an event that seized the individual, often unexpectedly, and produced a tangible sense of transformation. This reorientation had far-reaching implications. It suggested that spiritual truth was not the exclusive domain of the educated or the ordained, but was accessible to anyone capable of experiencing it. In doing so, it undermined the epistemological foundations of religious elitism. Edwards played a central role in articulating and legitimizing this new emphasis. He did not reject theology or intellectual rigor. Rather, he reframed them. For Edwards, true religion was not merely a matter of correct ideas, but of what he described as religious affections, deep, inward responses that engaged the whole person. Knowledge about God was insufficient without an accompanying transformation of the heart. This position functioned as a direct challenge to a form of intellectualism that had become detached from lived reality. If genuine faith required an experiential dimension, then the authority of those who claimed expertise based solely on education or office was called into question. The locus of truth shifted from the institution to the individual, from external validation to internal conviction. The impact of this redefinition was not purely theoretical. It manifested in striking physical and emotional responses among participants. Accounts from the revival describe individuals trembling, weeping uncontrollably, or even losing consciousness as they confronted what they perceived to be the reality of their spiritual Madgomariob. These reactions were not incidental, they were integral to the experience. They signaled a collapse of the distance between belief and embodiment. The body itself became a site of revelation, a medium through which the intensity of spiritual awakening was expressed. In a culture that had often emphasized restraint and decorum, such displays were both shocking and transformative. These physical manifestations carried significant social implications. In the established order, distinctions of class and status were carefully maintained, and religious practice often reinforced these boundaries. The revival, however, disrupted this pattern. The same overwhelming experiences were reported by individuals across the social spectrum, by the wealthy and the poor, the powerful and the marginalized. In moments of intense conviction or ecstatic release, traditional markers of identity lost their significance. What mattered was not one's position in society, but one's relationship to the divine. This leveling effect introduced a radical form of spiritual egalitarianism. It suggested that before God, all individuals were equally vulnerable, equally dependent, and equally capable of transformation. Moreover, the public nature of these experiences amplified their impact. As people witnessed others undergoing visible, often dramatic changes, the revival gained momentum. Testimony became a form of persuasion, and emotion functioned as evidence. The authenticity of the experience was validated not by institutional endorsement, but by its observable effects. This created a feedback loop in which personal encounters fueled collective participation, further eroding the authority of traditional gatekeepers. In this way, The Northampton Revival can be understood as the nokta koidaw of a broader rupture within the religious culture of the colonies. It exposed the limitations of a system that prioritized control over connection and hierarchy over immediacy. By foregrounding personal experience, Edwards and the movement he helped shape opened a space in which individuals could claim direct access to spiritual truth. This did not eliminate the role of institutions, but it fundamentally altered their position. They could no longer function as the sole arbiters of legitimacy. They had to contend with a form of authority that arose from within the individual. The implications of this shift extended beyond theology into the samajic and cultural fabric of colonial life. When people began to see themselves as capable of independent spiritual judgment, it became easier to imagine other forms of autonomy. The revival thus planted seeds that would later influence broader movements towards self-determination. What began as a spark in the valley was, in effect, the agas of a reorientation in how authority, experience, and identity were understood. A transformation that would continue to unfold in the decades that followed. Building on this reorientation of religious authority and experience, the next phase of the movement reveals an even more provocative dimension: the deliberate construction of a theological imagination designed to destabilize complacency at its deepest level. Nowhere is this more evident than in the sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," delivered by Jonathan Edwards. Far from being a mere rhetorical flourish, the sermon functions as a carefully engineered intervention into the psychological and spiritual assumptions of its audience. He conveys one of the most enduring and unsettling images in American religious history, that of a human being suspended like a spider over a fiery abyss, held only by the arbitrary will of an omnipotent deity. This image operates with striking symbolic efficiency. The human subject is reduced to something fragile, contingent, and profoundly exposed, the creature devoid of intrinsic security, whose existence hangs by a thread. The spider, often associated with insignificance or even revulsion, underscores the absence of inherent dignity when measured against divine power. In contrast, God is portrayed not as a distant or abstract principle, but as an immediate, overwhelming force whose authority is absolute and whose judgment is imminent. The distance between the human and the divine is not merely large, it is infinite, unbridgeable by any human effort, status, or institutional affiliation. What makes this imagery revolutionary is not simply its intensity, but its implications for social structure. In a world where religious and social hierarchies were deeply intertwined, the suggestion that all individuals, regardless of rank, education, or moral reputation, were equally precarious before divine judgment was profoundly destabilizing. The elite, who might have relied on their position, learning, or perceived righteousness as a buffer against existential uncertainty, found themselves stripped of these protections. The same metaphor applied equally to the poorest laborer and the most respected magistrate. In this sense, Wards's theology enacted a form of radical leveling. Before the possibility of damnation, all distinctions collapsed. The abyss did not discriminate. Yet the power of this sermon cannot be understood solely in terms of its imagery. Equally mahत्वपूर्ण is Edwards' strategic deployment of fear as a mechanism of transformation. Rather than treating fear as a negative emotion to be avoided, he harnessed what might be called existential fear, the awareness of one's vulnerability, finitude, and moral state as a catalyst for spiritual awakening. This was not fear in the sense of vague anxiety, but a highly focused confrontation with the possibility of immediate, irreversible judgment. The listener was compelled to recognize that their current state, however secure it might appear, offered no dhamana of safety. In this context, fear functioned as a disruptive force. It shattered the illusion of stability that underpinned both individual complacency and institutional authority. For the elite, it undermined the assumption that their status conferred spiritual privilege. For the broader population, it exposed the inadequacy of relying on external validation, whether from clergy, ritual participation, or social conformity. By intensifying the sense of Vyaktigat Khatra, Edwards effectively bypassed the traditional gatekeepers of religious experience. The urgency of the situation rendered mediation irrelevant. If one's soul could be lost at any moment, then waiting for institutional approval or guidance became untenable. Paradoxically, this use of fear opened the pathway to a new form of freedom. Once individuals accepted that no external structure could guarantee their salvation, they were compelled to seek a direct, unmediated relationship with the divine. The very emotion that initially produced terror also generated agency. It forced a nirnay, to remain passive and risk destruction, or to actively pursue transformation. In this way, fear became a tool of empowerment, albeit a harsh and uncompromising one. It relocated responsibility from the institution to the individual, from the collective to the personal. This shift had significant implications for the broader religious ecosystem. If individuals could, and indeed must, engage directly with God, then the role of clergy and established churches was fundamentally altered. They could still teach, guide, and interpret, but they could no longer claim exclusive control over access to the divine. The authority they had previously exercised was now contingent, subject to the validation of personal experience. In effect, Edwards's rhetoric contributed to the decentralization of religious power, even as it intensified the seriousness of religious commitment. The spread of these ideas further amplified their impact. Despite the presence of colonial systems that sought to regulate and contain potentially disruptive forms of expression, the message of the revival proved remarkably difficult to control. Sermons were shared not only within formal settings, but also through informal networks. Conversations in homes, gatherings in public spaces, and itinerant preaching that carried the message across geographic boundaries. Oral transmission played a crucial role, allowing the emotional intensity of the original delivery to be reenacted and adapted in new contexts. At the same time, print culture provided another channel of dissemination. Although not always sanctioned by official authorities, pamphlets, transcriptions, and summaries of sermons circulated widely. These texts functioned as portable artifacts of the revival, enabling ideas to travel beyond the simai of individual communities. The combination of oral and print transmission created what can be described as an early modern information network, decentralized, adaptive, and resistant to control. It did not rely on a single point of authority. Rather, it thrived on replication and reinterpretation. The natija was the emergence of a kind of underground intellectual and spiritual movement. This network did not operate in secrecy in the strict sense, but it existed parallel to and often in tension with official structures. Within it, individuals exchanged not only theological ideas, but also interpretations of their own experiences. Testimonies of conversion, accounts of emotional upheaval, and reflections on the nature of true faith circulated alongside formal arguments. Together, they formed a dynamic discourse that challenged established norms. Crucially, this discourse extended beyond purely religious concerns. As individuals began to assert the legitimacy of their own experiences and judgments in spiritual matters, questions naturally arose about other forms of authority. If one could not rely unquestioningly on institutional religion, what about political authority? If personal conviction could override clerical instruction, might it also challenge civil adish? While the revival did not explicitly advocate political rebellion, it cultivated habits of thought, skepticism toward Kendrikrit power, confidence in individual discernment, and a willingness to question inherited structures that would later prove significant. In this sense, the circulation of Edwards' ideas contributed to a broader debate about autonomy and freedom. The right to interpret one's own spiritual condition became intertwined with the right to exercise judgment in other kshetrong of life. Religious liberty, initially framed as the freedom to pursue authentic faith, began to expand into a more general principle of self-determination. The revival thus served as both a theological and a cultural turning point, linking the inner transformation of the individual with the postepenoe reconfiguration of society. What began as a vivid image, a spider suspended over an abyss, evolved into a complex system of ideas and practices that reshaped the relationship between fear, authority, and freedom. By confronting individuals with their vulnerability, Edwards did not merely induce panic. He initiated a process of re-evaluation that extended far beyond the immediate moment of the sermon. The Hof he invoked dismantled illusions. The urgency he created bypassed intermediaries, and the networks that carried his message ensured that its effects would not remain confined to a single place or time. In doing so, this phase of the movement deepened the rupture already underway, transforming a localized revival into a gesturdo, an enduring redefinition of religious and social possibility. As the movement progressed beyond the initial shock of existential confrontation and the destabilizing rhetoric of divine judgment, it entered a phase that can only be described as a theological earthquake, one that reshaped not merely religious feeling, but the very architecture of religious legitimacy. At the center of this transformation was the concept of rebirth, a term that, within this context, underwent a profound redefinition. No longer confined to doctrinal affirmation or sacramental participation, rebirth came to signify an intensely personal, experiential gatna, an inward rupture followed by spiritual renewal that could neither be predicted nor controlled by institutional mechanisms. For Jonathan Edwards and those aligned with the revival, true rebirth was not something that could be conferred by the Church in any formal sense. It was not guaranteed by baptism, church membership, or adherence to prescribed rituals. Instead, it emerged as a deeply subjective experience, often marked by emotional intensity and a sense of direct encounter with the divine. This shift effectively relocated the source of spiritual authority from the Almoesasa to the individual. The Church could no longer claim to administer salvation in a definitive way. At best, it could bear witness to transformations that occurred beyond its control. The implications of this redefinition were far-reaching. In the earlier system, the church functioned as a gatekeeper not only of spiritual status but also of social legitimacy. To be recognized as a member in good standing was to possess a form of moral certification that extended into civic life. Reputation, trustworthiness, and even access to certain opportunities could depend on one's recognized religious status. However, if rebirth was an anubhav that could not be regulated or verified by institutional criteria, then the Church's ability to confer or withhold legitimacy was fundamentally compromised. Individuals who experienced what they believed to be genuine transformation could assert their spiritual authenticity regardless of official recognition. Conversely, those who held positions of authority could no longer rely on their status as evidence of true faith. This erosion of institutional control did not occur without resistance. On the contrary, it generated a sharp and highly visible conflict within the religious communities of the colonies, crystallizing into what became known as the division between New Lights and Old Lights. This was not merely a theological disagreement. It was a cultural sangharsh that exposed competing visions of authority, knowledge, and social order. The New Lights embraced the revival's emphasis on personal experience, emotional expression, and the darura of individual transformation. They viewed the established system as stagnant, overly formalized, and spiritually ineffective. For them, the alamat of true religion were not intellectual precision or ritual correctness, but the observable athar of inward change. The Old Lights, by contrast, defended the existing structures. They emphasized the importance of doctrinal stability, clerical authority, and orderly worship. From their perspective, the revival's excesses, its emotional displays, its challenges to established leaders, its apparent disregard for institutional nodhum, posed a threat not only to religious integrity, but also to social cohesion. If individuals were encouraged to prioritize personal experience over established authority, what would prevent chaos? How could communities maintain unity if every person claimed direct access to truth? These concerns were not trivial. They reflected a genuine anxiety about the Sambhavit consequences of decentralizing authority in a society that depended on shared norms and structures. The conflict between these two groups can be understood as one of the earliest manifestations of a pattern that would recur throughout American history. The tension between institutional al-muhafdha and experiential innovation, between those who seek to preserve established nodhum and those who push for transformative change. In this sense, the New Light-Old Light divide functioned as a prototype for later cultural and political polarizations. It introduced a vocabulary of opposition, authenticity versus formalism, freedom versus order, al-fard versus al-mu'assasa, that would continue to shape discourse far beyond the dharmic sphere. At the same time, the broader consequences of the revival extended beyond this internal sangharsh. As the monopoly of institutional religion weakened, new spaces opened for individuals who had previously been marginalized or excluded. The emphasis on personal experience meant that spiritual authority could no longer be monopolized by those with education, wealth, or official pad. Anyone capable of articulating a compelling account of transformation could claim a voice within the religious community. This had particular significance for groups whose participation had been limited under the old nidham. For the poor, the revival offered a form of recognition that transcended economic status. In a system where social hierarchy often dictated one's visibility and influence, the ability to testify to a powerful spiritual experience provided an alternative muster of authority. A laborer or servant who could describe a moment of profound awakening might command attention and respect in ways that were previously unimaginable. Similarly, for women who were frequently excluded from formal leadership roles, the revival created opportunities to participate more actively in religious life. While it did not eliminate structural inequalities, it did allow for a rashireni of influence through testimony, exhortation, and informal leadership. Even those on the margins of legal or social acceptance found in the revival a potential avenue for inclusion. The decentralized nature of the movement meant that participation was not strictly regulated by institutional gatekeepers. Communities formed around shared experiences rather than formal membership, and these communities could be more flexible in their boundaries. In this sense, the revival contributed to a gradual prakriya of democratization within the religious sphere. Authority became more diffuse, more contested, and more accessible. This transformation also altered the functional role of religion itself. Under the earlier system, religion had often operated as ada of control, reinforcing existing hierarchies and legitimizing established authority. By contrast, the revival recast religion as a potential instrument of empowerment. It provided individuals with a framework for asserting their own arzesh and agency, independent of institutional validation. The emphasis on direct experience encouraged people to trust their own perceptions and judgments, fostering a sense of atmanirbharta that extended beyond the strictly spiritual domain. However, this shift was not without its ambiguities. The same decentralization that enabled empowerment also introduced new forms of uncertainty. Without a clear kender of authority, how could conflicting claims be adjudicated? If personal experience was the mayar of truth, what prevented manipulation or Brahm? These questions underscored the complexity of the transformation. The erosion of control did not simply produce freedom, it created a dynamic and often unstable medan in which new forms of authority had to be negotiated. Nevertheless, the overall litija of the movement was clear. The theological earthquake initiated by the redefinition of rebirth and intensified by the conflict between new lights and old lights resulted in a lasting reconfiguration of religious life. It dismantled the assumption that legitimacy flowed exclusively from established institutions and replaced it with a more fluid, contested, and participatory model. In doing so, it laid the groundwork for a broader cultural shift toward individual empowerment and skepticism of centralized authority. By the time this phase of the revival had run its course, the religious landscape of the colonies had been irreversibly altered. The church no longer stood unchallenged as the arbiter of spiritual and social legitimacy. Individuals had discovered, through both fear and experience, that they possessed a capacity for direct engagement with the divine. And in that discovery lay the seeds of a new understanding of self, community, and power, one that would continue to evolve in the chapters that followed. As the theological and institutional disruptions of the revival matured, their effects began to extend beyond the boundaries of doctrine and ecclesiastical structure into something broader and more consequential. the emergence of a shared identity that transcended the fragmented geography of the British colonies. What had begun as a series of localized awakenings, intense, often chaotic eruptions of spiritual experience, gradually coalesced into a movement now recognized as the Great Awakening. This movement did not simply spread, it connected. In doing so, it laid the groundwork for what can be described as one of the earliest forms of a collective American consciousness. One of the defining features of this phenomenon was its ability to move across boundaries that had previously been rigid and consequential. The British colonies in North America were not a unified entity. They were administratively distinct, economically diverse, and often culturally disconnected. Each Scotch colony operated through its own governance structures, with loyalties oriented as much toward local concerns and imperial authority as toward any shared identity. Yet the revival cut across these divisions with remarkable fluidity. The same themes, the same emotional patterns, and the same language of transformation appeared in places separated by vast distances. What people experience in one colony resonated with those in another, creating a sense of simultaneity and recognition that was unprecedented. This was not merely a matter of similar ideas appearing in different locations. It was the formation of a shared spiritual space that existed alongside, and in some ways above, the formal structures of colonial administration. Individuals who had never met, who lived under different laws and in different social contexts, nonetheless began to see themselves as participants in a common movement. They were united not by political institutions or economic interests, but by a shared narrative of awakening, crisis, and renewal. This narrative provided a framework through which disparate experiences could be interpreted as part of a larger whole. In effect, the revival created an imagined community grounded in spiritual experience rather than territorial or institutional privileges. Central to the formation and vistae of this transcolonial movement was the figure of George Whitefield. If Edwards provided the theological depth and conceptual framework for the revival, Whitefield embodied its communicative and performative dimensions. His approach to preaching represented a significant departure from established norms. Rather than confining himself to the pulpit within church walls, he took his message into open fields, public squares, and any space where people could gather. This practice of open-air preaching was not merely a logistical adaptation. It was a strategic innovation that redefined the relationship between speaker, audience, and environment. By removing the physical boundaries of the church, Whitefield also dismantled the symbolic barriers that had long regulated access to religious discourse. In traditional settings, the architecture of the church reinforced hierarchy. The elevated pulpit, the ordered seating, the controlled atmosphere, all contributed to a sense of structure and authority. In contrast, the open-air setting was inherently more fluid and inclusive. Crowds could gather in large numbers, often cutting across lines of class, gender, and occupation. The act of listening became a collective experience, less constrained by formal expectations and more open to emotional engagement. Whitefield's oratorical style further amplified this effect. He was known for his dramatic delivery, his ability to modulate tone and pace, and his capacity to evoke strong emotional responses. In an era before electronic amplification, his voice carried not only through volume, but through intensity and expressiveness. Listeners were not passive recipients of information. They were drawn into a shared emotional field, experiencing the message as something immediate and compelling. This mode of communication proved highly effective in mobilizing large audiences and sustaining the momentum of the revival across regions. The impact of these innovations extended beyond the mechanics of preaching. By bypassing traditional ecclesiastical structures, Whitefield effectively challenged the monopoly of established churches over religious communication. He demonstrated that it was possible to reach vast audiences without institutional mediation, thereby weakening the control that clergy and local authorities had previously exercised. In doing so, he contributed to the decentralization of religious authority that had already been set in motion by the theological shifts associated with Edwards. The message no longer belonged to a specific institution. It circulated freely, carried by itinerant preachers, printed materials, and the testimonies of participants. As this network expanded, it began to produce effects that were not strictly religious. The shared experiences and narratives of the revival fostered a sense of connection among individuals who might otherwise have remained isolated within their respective colonies. They began to see patterns in their experiences, to recognize common struggles and aspirations, and to interpret their local al-ahdath as part of a broader movement. This process of recognition was crucial in the formation of a collective identity. It allowed people to imagine themselves as part of something larger than their immediate samuday, to conceive of a we that extended beyond local and colonial boundaries. Within this emerging framework, the language of religion gradually took on additional layers of meaning. Themes of awakening, liberation, and transformation, initially framed in spiritual terms, began to resonate with broader concerns about authority and autonomy. The idea that individuals could challenge established religious structures and assert their own experiences as valid sources of truth had implications that extended into the political realm. While the revival did not explicitly advocate rebellion against British rule, it cultivated habits of thought and modes of expression that would later prove conducive to such challenges. In particular, the emphasis on personal conviction and the skepticism toward centralized authority created a cultural waterworn in which resistance could be imagined and articulated. The same logic that led individuals to question the authority of clergy could, under different circumstances, be applied to political resulta. Moreover, the networks that facilitated the spread of revivalist ideas also provided channels through which other forms of discourse could circulate. Information, arguments, and sentiments could move across colonies with increasing surah, reinforcing the sense of interconnectedness that the revival had helped to establish. This convergence of religious and proto-political dynamics contributed to the formation of a shared narrative of resistance. People began to interpret their experiences not only as spiritual awakenings, but as part of a broader kahani about struggle, renewal, and the assertion of autonomy. This narrative did not yet take the form of a coherent political ideology, but it provided a conceptual foundation upon which such an ideology could later be built. It introduced themes: opposition to imposed authority, the schema of individual judgment, the possibility of collective action, that would become central to the revolutionary discourse of the late 18th century. The connection between the revival and subsequent political developments should not be understood as direct causation, but as a process of cultural tayari. By the time events such as the battles of Lexington and Concord occurred, the colonies had already undergone a significant transformation in how individuals understood themselves and their relationship to authority. The revival had contributed to this transformation by fostering a sense of Saja identity and by normalizing the idea that established structures could be questioned and, if necessary, reconfigured. In this sense, the Great Awakening can be seen as a precursor to the emergence of an American national consciousness. It did not create a nation in the Rajneetic sense, but it helped to create the conditions under which a nation could be imagined. By linking individuals across distances, by providing a shared language of experience, and by challenging existing hierarchies, it laid the groundwork for a Pudi form of collective identity. What began as a series of spiritual upheavals thus evolved into a formative moment in the development of a society, increasingly defined not by imposed Nadom, but by the interplay of individual conviction and collective aspiration. As the reverberations of the revival continued to move outward, reshaping theology, authority, and collective identity, they also crystallized into something more enduring, a cultural archetype that would come to define not only a historical moment, but a persistent feature of American consciousness. This archetype is that of the outsider, the individual, who stands at a critical distance from established systems, guided less by institutional directives than by an inward sense of conviction. While this figure did not emerge fully formed in the 18th century, the conditions created by the revival, especially through the work of Jonathan Edwards and the broader movement of the Great Awakening, provided fertile ground for its duhur. At its core, this archetype is defined by a reorientation of trust. Instead of locating authority in external structures, churches, officials, inherited doctrines, the individual learns to rely on personal discernment. This does not necessarily imply a rejection of all institutions, but it does introduce a fundamental skepticism toward their claims to ultimate authority. The outsider is not simply rebellious. Rather, they are selective, evaluating systems based on whether those systems align with an internally validated sense of truth. This disposition can be traced back to the revival's insistence at genuine faith must be experienced rather than merely accepted. Once individuals internalized the idea that spiritual authenticity could not be conferred from the outside, it became possible to extend that logic into other kshetro of life. Over time, this orientation evolved into a recognizable cultural pattern. The figure who questions authority, who resists conformity, and who prioritizes personal authenticity over collective expectation became not an anomaly, but an ideal. This is particularly significant in a society that would later define itself, at least in part, through narratives of independence and self-determination. The revival did not invent these values, but it provided one of the earliest Vyapak frameworks through which they could be articulated and normalized. In this sense, the outsider is less a marginal figure than a foundational one, a paradox that reflects the enduring tension between individuality and community. The resonance of this archetype becomes even more apparent when considered alongside contemporary movements that emphasize authenticity and personal expression. Although separated by centuries and shaped by vastly different contexts, there is a clear continuity between the revival's emphasis on inward transformation and modern cultural currents that prioritize being true to oneself. In both cases, there is a rejection of externally imposed standards in favor of self-defined identity. Whether in the realm of spirituality, social activism, or personal development, the underlying logic remains similar. Legitimacy arises from within, not from conformity to established norms. This continuity can be understood as a structural analogy rather than a direct historical line. The revival's call for personal religious experience parallels modern critiques of rigid systems, whether those systems are institutional, cultural, or ideological. Just as the New Lights challenge the authority of traditional clergy, contemporary movements often challenge the authority of entrenched institutions, advocating for more fluid, inclusive, and individualized forms of participation. The emphasis on authenticity becomes a unifying thread, linking seemingly disparate phenomena across time. It represents a shift from compliance to self-expression, from inherited identity to constructed identity. However, this emphasis on authenticity also carries complexities. The same impulse that empowers individuals to assert their uniqueness can also lead to fragmentation, as shared standards become more difficult to sustain. The revival itself faced this tension, as the decentralization of authority produced both liberation and vivad. In the modern context, similar dynamics are at play. The valorization of personal truth can coexist with challenges in establishing common ground. Yet this tension is not necessarily a flaw. It is a reflection of the ongoing negotiation between individual autonomy and collective coherence, a negotiation that began in a significant way during the upheavals of the 18th century. When viewed from a broader Tarihi perspective, the revival can be interpreted as a kind of foundational blueprint, a spiritual revolution whose effects extended far beyond its immediate context. Its long-term impact is perhaps most visible in the development of American individualism, a cultural orientation that places a high kima on personal freedom, self-reliance, and the pursuit of meaning. While these traits have multiple sources, the revival contributed a crucial dimension: the idea that the most important truths about one's life are not assigned by external authorities but discovered through personal experience. This redefinition of meaning had profound implications. It suggested that life should not be understood primarily in terms of roles prescribed by the state, the church, or society at large. Instead, it encouraged individuals to seek a sense of purpose that is internally grounded and personally significant. In doing so, it shifted the mayar by which success and fulfillment were measured. External validation, status, recognition, conformity became less central than the alignment between one's inner convictions and outward actions. This shift did not eliminate the influence of institutions, but it introduced a countervailing alkuwa that continually challenges their authority. At the same time, it is important to recognize that this spiritual revolution was not a singular event but an ongoing process. The patterns it established, questioning authority, valuing experience, seeking authenticity, have been reinterpreted and reconfigured across different historical moments. They have inspired movements for religious reform, social justice, and cultural innovation, each adapting the underlying logic to new circumstances. In this sense, the legacy of the revival is not fixed. It is dynamic, continually evolving as individuals and communities grapple with the balance between freedom and structure. As we draw these threads together, it becomes clear that the events that began in Northampton were far more than a localized religious awakening. They constituted a multi-layered transformation that reshaped how people understood themselves, their communities, and the systems that governed their lives. What initially appeared as a crisis of faith became, in retrospect, a catalyst for a broader reconfiguration of thought and practice. The boundaries between theology, culture, and politics blurred, giving rise to new forms of identity and jadid modes of engagement. The final synthesis, then, is this. The movement was not merely a religious event, but a thora in perception, in social organization, and in the distribution of authority. It challenged the assumption that legitimacy flows from the top down and replaced it with a more Pichedihi model in which individuals play an active role in defining truth and meaning. From the small community of Northampton, a set of ideas emerged that would contribute to the development of personal freedom, the assertion of self-determination, and the gradual formation of an early national identity. These ideas did not remain confined to sermons or theological debates. They entered the fabric of everyday life, shaping how people imagined their possibilities and their adhikar. If this exploration has helped clarify how a seemingly localized revival evolved into a transformative force with lasting cultural and political implications, consider following the channel and subscribing for deeper analyses of historical movements that continue to shape the modern world.